I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had entered the private Windsor meeting expecting a routine legal clarification. Instead, he watched 3 senior lawyers place a sealed inheritance file before him and confirm the decision he had feared most. The Windsor Estate fortune, its private holdings, historic residences, investment income, and generational authority would pass directly to Prince William. Charles remained motionless as the meaning settled over the room. His son had not merely inherited wealth. William had inherited the future Charles believed was still his to shape. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had arrived beside William and Camilla, believing the meeting would settle minor questions about administration. The king faced the crown's chief solicitor and 2 estate trustees, officials responsible for protecting property and carrying out its legal instructions. The atmosphere remained controlled until the lead lawyer opened a dark leather inheritance file and began reading. The solicitor stated the central decision without hesitation. Prince William was the sole principal beneficiary of the Windsor Estate fortune. The estate included private investments, residential interests, agricultural income, historic collections, and long-term management authority. That ruling mattered because it transferred more than money. It gave the future king direct control over resources capable of shaping the monarchy's next era. Charles removed his glasses and placed them beside the file. The monarch asked the lawyers to repeat the ruling, his voice lower than before. He had expected to retain lifetime control, guiding the fortune until he personally decided how and when authority should pass. William felt no triumph. The prince watched his father's expression collapse and understood that the legal decision had become a personal wound. His inheritance now looked like an accusation, as though the future had chosen him before Charles was ready to release it. Camilla noticed something the others had missed. The queen saw a handwritten notation attached to the final page, stating that the transfer could not be delayed, amended, or redirected through the king's household. She asked the chief solicitor, who had authorized such final language. The lawyer answered through the meeting's recorded legal account. A succession clause, a binding instruction activated when the crown passed to a new reign, had been signed years before Charles became monarch. Once triggered, it transferred Windsor's principal authority directly to William. No royal preference could reverse it. The trustees closed their folders and left. Charles kept one hand pressed against the inheritance file, then asked William to remain behind. The lawyers had explained who would receive Windsor's fortune, but they had not explained why the inheritance had been designed to bypass Charles so completely, and that answer was buried inside the people now trapped around the same table. The fortune was measured in estates, investments, paintings, land, and centuries of accumulated privilege, yet inside the room, none of those things mattered as much as the silence between Charles and William. One man saw Windsor as the final proof of his place in royal history. The other saw it as a duty he had never asked to receive this way. Between them sat Camilla, aware that the ruling threatened not only Charles's pride, but her own security within the royal household. Charles had always viewed Windsor as more than property. The king saw it as proof of continuity, belonging, and royal legitimacy. He had spent years believing he would personally reorganize its wealth, protect its historic collections, and decide how its legacy should pass forward. Losing that control while still reigning made the decision feel less like inheritance and more like removal. William understood the danger immediately. The prince was already heir to the throne and carried major responsibilities, but control of the Windsor fortune gave him something new: financial independence beyond his father's direct influence. That mattered because money shaped staff, residences, public projects, and long-term authority. The transfer strengthened his future, yet it weakened the bond he most needed to preserve. Charles finally broke the silence during a private exchange recorded in the meeting notes. He told William that inheritance should follow death, not make a living father feel replaced. The words were quiet, but they carried years of fear. The king believed history had begun moving past him before he had finished shaping it. William answered carefully, He said he had never requested the transfer and would have preferred to receive his father's trust before receiving control of Windsor's assets. The future king did not reject the responsibility, but he refused to treat it as victory. His pain came from knowing that success had arrived wearing the face of betrayal. Camilla faced another fear. The Queen privately asked the chief solicitor whether her residence, staff provisions, and personal allowances remained protected under the new ownership structure. The solicitor explained that the ownership structure was the legal system deciding who controlled property and funding, but he gave her no immediate answer. That silence unsettled her more than any formal refusal. Then the final page revealed another name. Princess Anne had witnessed the original inheritance arrangement. Charles understood at once that his sister had known William's position was secured long before the family was informed. The king ordered Anne to come to Windsor that evening. After William left, Charles crossed to the window. Camilla approached, but he raised one hand without turning, asking her not to speak. For several seconds, he stared across land that legally no longer belonged to his future. Charles could endure the law, but he could not endure the possibility that his own family had prepared the transfer in secret, and Princess Anne was about to reveal the moment when that decision became unavoidable. The inheritance had not begun with a lawyer's announcement. It began years earlier, during a private Windsor dinner that ended with a broken promise, a closed study door, and a decision no one believed would ever become public. That night, Charles spoke with confidence about the future of the estate. William listened without interrupting. Anne watched both men carefully. By midnight, a conversation intended to protect royal unity had instead convinced one senior family member that Windsor's fortune could no longer remain under Charles's unrestricted control. Charles had long assumed he would manage Windsor for life, before gradually transferring authority to William. The estate was not simply land and wealth. It was a private power base tied to residences, investments, staff, and long-term family influence. Anne understood that danger better than most. The Princess Royal had become the family's institutional memory, the person who remembered how earlier decisions, private promises, and succession plans could shape generations. Charles reacted with disbelief when Anne admitted she had signed the original arrangement as a witness. The king accused his sister of helping to strip him of control before his reign had properly settled. She answered that loyalty to her brother could not outweigh her duty to protect the monarchy's future stability. Anne had defended him for decades, but she would not defend a decision she believed could fracture Windsor permanently. William remembered the dinner, though he insisted he had never known what happened afterward. The prince's discomfort deepened, because the hidden clause now benefited him directly. He had sat through that conversation as a son, not as a future beneficiary, and the distinction mattered. Any appearance of secret cooperation could destroy what remained of his father's trust. Anne then named the decisive incident. During the Windsor Restoration dinner, a private meeting intended to settle long-term plans for the estate, Charles announced that he wanted several major assets placed inside a new household trust. A household trust is a legal structure used to protect money or property for selected family members over time. His proposal would have secured Camilla's relatives financially for decades. The room changed after that admission. Anne had feared that Windsor's core fortune would be broken apart, redirected, and tied to household loyalties rather than preserved for the direct royal line. After the dinner, she met privately with the late Queen's estate advisor. Through a documented legal consultation, they activated a dormant succession clause, ensuring that Windsor would pass intact to William instead of being divided among separate trusts. Anne removed a small notebook from her handbag and began reading Charles's exact words from that night. He told her to stop. She closed it, but the damage was complete. Charles finally understood the truth. The clause had not been created to enrich William. It had been created to stop him. The past had finally supplied the motive, but it also gave Charles someone to confront, and before the night ended, the king would demand that William choose between accepting Windsor and defending his father. Charles did not summon William as monarch to heir. He summoned him as a wounded father, confronting the son who now possessed the one inheritance he could not recover. With no advisors standing between them, the king pushed the legal file across the table and demanded a simple act of loyalty: refuse Windsor. William looked down at the papers, then back at his father. His answer would determine whether the fortune remained a legal matter or became an open fracture within the royal family. Charles had deliberately excluded aides, secretaries, and legal representatives from the sitting room. He wanted no formal language protecting either man from the truth. The succession structure, the binding legal arrangement, deciding how the estate passed forward, allowed William to reject personal benefits, but not to erase the wider transfer. Refusal could scatter control across contested trusts, freeze decisions, and create years of uncertainty around Windsor's land, income, and historic collections. Charles accused his son of accepting authority too easily. The king said William had begun behaving like a monarch before his father's reign had reached its defining purpose. To him, the transfer was not merely premature, it was humiliating. His own future seemed to be narrowing, while the prince's power expanded without permission. William absorbed the accusation but refused to surrender the truth. He explained that rejecting Windsor would not restore control to Charles. It would push the estate into a disputed trust structure and damage the institution both men claimed to protect. The future king had not asked for the fortune, but once it became his responsibility, abandoning it would turn family pain into institutional chaos. Charles then revealed, through a recorded private exchange later preserved in the legal account, that he had already instructed his council to search for a royal prerogative capable of suspending the transfer. A royal prerogative is an authority traditionally exercised by the sovereign, though it cannot simply override binding private arrangements. The admission proved he had not accepted defeat. William answered with a revelation of his own. The estate trustees had contacted him before the meeting and warned that any interference would trigger an immediate protective lock on Windsor's accounts. That lock would prevent funds, assets, and management rights from being moved while the dispute was examined. Charles stood and gripped the back of a chair. He ordered William to look him in the eye. The prince rose as well but did not retreat. "Will you reject it for me?" Charles demanded. "I will protect it for everyone," William replied. The king slowly released the chair. Then he asked whether his son had personally authorized the protective measure. William did not answer at once, and that silence transformed suspicion into something more dangerous. William's refusal ended the argument between father and son, but it opened a far more dangerous battle with the trustees, whose signatures now carried more practical power over Windsor than the sovereign's anger. A crown could command ceremonies, governments, and the loyalty of a nation, but it could not erase a private inheritance instrument protected by trustees, signatures, and carefully written restrictions. Charles entered the next meeting, determined to prove that kingship still carried decisive authority. Instead, he discovered a structure designed specifically to survive royal pressure. At the center stood the chief trustee, an elderly advisor who had served the family for decades and who now had to tell the king that Windsor was no longer his to reorganize. The trustee board controlled the transition, while William became the beneficial owner and long-term custodian. A beneficial owner is the person entitled to receive the value and authority of an asset, even when trustees still supervise its legal protection. That structure mattered because Windsor's wealth could not be allowed to splinter between rival households, private promises, or family branches seeking permanent security. Charles defended himself immediately. The king insisted that his plans for Camilla's family had never been selfish. He had wanted to protect people who might lose support when his reign ended. To him, the proposed trusts were acts of loyalty. The trustees heard something different. Windsor's assets, they answered, could not become compensation for private fears or a shield against future uncertainty. The chief trustee struggled to continue. His voice trembled as he told Charles that he had respected him personally for 40 years. He had advised the family through grief, transition, and public crisis. Yet respect could not change the clause. Duty required him to enforce every word exactly as written. Then he opened the sealed appendix. An appendix is an added legal section containing conditions that apply when specific events occur. Its central restriction was brutal. If any serving monarch attempted to alter Windsor's beneficiary structure, the transfer would accelerate immediately. Charles understood the danger too late. His instruction to private counsel had already activated the provision. The challenge meant William would receive operational authority sooner than planned. Resistance had not slowed the transfer, it had strengthened it. The chief trustee placed his pen on the table and slid the activation notice toward Charles. The monarch did not touch it. William reached forward, read the first page, and felt the weight of the next sentence settle over him. He now had 48 hours to approve Windsor's first protected budget. That budget would determine staff provisions, residence costs, and family-linked allowances, including arrangements affecting Camilla. Charles looked toward his son, but there was no triumph in William's expression. The prince understood that his first act of control would force him to make decisions touching the woman his father had tried to protect. The legal battle was over before Charles realized it had begun, and the first consequences would not appear in a courtroom. They would arrive through locked accounts, revised household budgets, and one devastating conversation with Camilla. Camilla had watched the inheritance crisis from the edge of the room, saying little, while lawyers discussed fortunes, trustees, and succession clauses. But the new reality became personal when a household secretary arrived with a revised Windsor budget. 3 allowances were frozen. A planned residence renovation was suspended. Financial support connected to her adult children required William's approval. For the first time since becoming queen, she understood that the estate transfer was not an abstract defeat for Charles. It had entered her own home. William's first obligation was to protect estate spending until every allowance, residence arrangement, and private commitment could be examined. The protected budget, a temporary financial plan designed to stop disputed money from moving, gave him 48 hours to review obligations created under Charles's household. Several provisions had expanded during the king's planning, and the trustees believed personal loyalty had begun shaping decisions meant to serve the direct royal line. Camilla felt accused by a structure she had not written. The Queen told Charles that the family had turned his attempt to protect her into evidence against both of them. Her anger was not only about money. Each frozen payment suggested that her place remained conditional, dependent on decisions made by people preparing for a future in which she might hold no influence. Charles finally admitted what pride had kept him from saying. The king apologized and confessed that his plan to secure her family's future had triggered the clause that stripped him of Windsor's control. He had wanted to create safety. Instead, he had made their intentions look like a threat to the estate's survival. Camilla studied the revised budget more closely and discovered that William had cancelled nothing. The prince had paused each provision pending a face-to-face review. That distinction mattered. Punishment would have ended the arrangements immediately. Review meant his final judgment remained open. Then she found a private note attached to the papers. William wrote that her personal dignity, residence, and proper support would be preserved. Windsor's fortune, however, would not pass beyond the direct royal line. The future king was drawing a boundary, not erasing her. Camilla sat at her dressing table holding the budget, while Charles stood behind her. She removed a bracelet, placed it carefully beside the papers, and said, "You tried to make me safe, and now you have lost the place that made you feel safe." Charles had no reply. Camilla then requested a private meeting with William, without the king present. She believed only a direct conversation could stop the inheritance from destroying father and son permanently. The frozen accounts exposed the cost of Charles's choices, but Camilla's private meeting with William would reveal whether the new heir intended to punish the past or build a different future from it. There were no trustees in the room, no legal files, and no palace officials waiting to record the outcome. Camilla met William alone, in a small Windsor drawing room, where every word carried more weight, because neither could hide behind procedure. She expected anger. He expected a defense of her family's interests. Instead, the conversation began with an unexpected admission. Camilla told him Charles was not devastated because he had lost money. He was devastated because Windsor's decision made him feel that his own family had stopped trusting him. Camilla had requested a personal meeting, not a legal negotiation. The Queen brought no advisors, proposed budget, or financial demand. That choice mattered, because it stripped the dispute down to its human core. She was not asking William to reverse ownership. She was asking him to understand what the transfer had done to his father. William listened, then explained what accepting Windsor meant to him. The prince believed the estate had to be preserved for George, Charlotte, Louis, and the generations after them. Custodianship, the duty of protecting property for future heirs, could not become a weapon for rewarding loyalty or punishing present relationships. If he allowed that, Windsor would become exactly what the succession clause had been designed to prevent. Camilla admitted the fear beneath Charles's plan. The king had tried to protect her because he believed she might be abandoned once his reign ended. At first, she had accepted that concern as love. Over time, however, his fear became a source of division, encouraging promises that placed her security against the direct royal line. William then confessed something he had told no one directly. Accepting the inheritance terrified him because he feared Charles would believe his son was waiting impatiently for the throne. The future king had wanted his father's confidence, not an early transfer that made duty resemble ambition. Camilla saw an opening. She asked William to give Charles one meaningful role within Windsor, not financial control, but a responsibility, proving that his knowledge and legacy still mattered. The request did not threaten ownership. It offered dignity. William considered it, then agreed to appoint Charles honorary chair of Windsor's Historic Conservation Program. An honorary chair provides guidance and public leadership without controlling legal ownership or money. The king would help direct restoration, archives, and cultural preservation while the estate remained protected. Camilla rose to leave, but William asked her to wait. He wrote the appointment on a plain sheet of paper, signed it, and placed it in her hands. She did not smile. She closed her fingers around it and said, "Tell him yourself. He needs to hear that he still matters from you." William decided he would. William had found a way to preserve his father's dignity without surrendering Windsor's future. But the family's private compromise was about to collide with headlines that reduced their pain to victory, defeat, and royal humiliation. By sunrise, the private inheritance ruling had become a national drama. Television studios displayed images of Charles and William beneath banners declaring a historic transfer of royal wealth. Commentators called it a victory for the future and a humiliation for the present. Outside Windsor Castle, crowds gathered beneath cold morning skies, some cheering William's new authority, while others expressed sympathy for a king who appeared to have been overtaken inside his own reign. The legal decision was settled, but public judgment had only begun. The palace announced that William would inherit and manage the Windsor Estate fortune, while Charles retained ceremonial access and leadership of its conservation mission. The conservation mission, the program responsible for protecting historic buildings, archives, and collections, gave the king a meaningful role without restoring financial control. Officials stressed continuity, but the communications team struggled to stop the story from being framed as a forced removal. Charles watched one broadcaster after another describe him as bypassed. The king understood the compromise, yet the word made his new position sound like consolation after defeat. Every headline reduced years of service to a single cruel idea. The future had moved around him rather than through him. William reacted with growing frustration. The prince instructed his press office to remove language praising his victory and demanded that every statement emphasize cooperation between generations. He had accepted ownership to preserve Windsor, not to humiliate his father. Yet success and suffering had become impossible to separate. The stronger William appeared, the more diminished Charles seemed. Then one newspaper sharpened the wound. Its front page showed William walking through Windsor's gates beneath the headline, "The fortune passes to the son." A smaller image showed Charles alone in a car. The contrast was brutal. One man appeared to be entering the future while the other seemed carried away from it. The story shifted during a live broadcast outside the castle. The palace released a photograph of Charles and William reviewing restoration plans together. Restoration plans are detailed proposals for repairing and preserving historic royal property. The image showed shared responsibility rather than surrender, and the emotional framing changed almost instantly. A crowd near the gates fell silent as the photograph appeared on a broadcaster's large screen. One woman began applauding, not for William's inheritance, but for the sight of father and son standing beside the same plans. Others slowly joined her, until the applause spread through the gathering. Charles saw the reaction, and understood the opportunity. William saw it too. The public was no longer demanding a winner. It was asking whether both men could protect Windsor without destroying each other. The photograph softened the nation's judgment, but images could not complete the reconciliation. Charles and William still had to stand together inside Windsor and define, in their own words, what the fortune would now represent. The final ceremony was deliberately small. No cheering crowd filled the courtyard, and no grand procession celebrated William's new fortune. Inside Windsor's historic hall, the estate trustees placed the transfer register before father and son. Charles could have treated the moment as the public confirmation of everything he had lost. Instead, he looked at William, took the ceremonial pen, and signed as witness. It was not a surrender of kingship. It was a father's painful acceptance that protecting the monarchy sometimes meant allowing the future to arrive before he felt ready. William now became the official custodian of the Windsor Estate fortune, responsible for preserving its wealth, residences, historic collections, and long-term financial stability. A custodian is the person legally trusted to protect property for future generations, rather than treat it as personal reward. That responsibility mattered because Windsor's survival now depended on discipline, not private promises. Charles accepted leadership of the Windsor Conservation Council, the body overseeing restoration priorities, archives, traditional craftsmanship, and cultural preservation. The king retained no ownership power, yet he gained a role shaped by knowledge and service. For the first time, purpose no longer required possession. Charles paused before signing, and admitted, through the ceremony's recorded account, that the ruling had devastated him because he had confused control with relevance. Losing Windsor forced the monarch to confront his deepest fear, that history might move forward while he was still trying to prove his reign mattered. William answered without triumph. The prince told his father that inheritance could never erase the man who had prepared him to carry it. Legal authority now rested with the future king, but Windsor would remain a shared family responsibility. He promised that Charles's experience would guide the estate even when his signature no longer controlled it. Charles then turned toward Anne. The king acknowledged that her intervention had protected Windsor from being divided by personal fear. He thanked his sister without warmth, but with unmistakable sincerity. Anne accepted the words quietly, understanding that trust would return slowly. Camilla's residence, staff, and dignity remained protected. The queen consort would not be abandoned. However, financial arrangements benefiting extended relatives were removed from Windsor's core fortune. William had drawn a final boundary. Compassion could preserve people, but inheritance could not be redirected to calm private insecurity. After the register was signed, William closed it and offered the ceremonial pen to Charles. The king studied it, then placed it back in his son's hand. They left together, with the monarch pausing only once before continuing forward. Windsor's fortune passed to William, but the greater inheritance was the lesson Charles finally accepted. A monarchy survives not when one generation refuses to release its power, but when it gives the next generation enough trust to carry history without being crushed by it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.